My name's Andrew Thinn. I'm chairman of the Scottish Land Commission and have been for over 7 years, actually. Um, I'll, uh, I'm also a board member of the Crofting Commission. I also work in the Prisons Inspectorate. Um, but I'll say a bit more about what this is about, why we're here, and so on in a minute. Before I do that, I just want to make sure that we introduce the two other people who are here from the Commission. Lauren, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. My name's Lauren MacLeod. I'm one of the commissioners. I'm based in Oban. Prior to joining the Commission, I was the chairman of Community Land Scotland, which is the representative body for community landowners in Scotland. I've been involved with the land reform for about 30 years now. I was also involved in some of the larger community buyouts in the islands. So I'm very pleased to be with you this evening and to hear what the key issues in the Glasgow area are, and also to discuss some of the work that we've been involved with over the last few years. Thank you, Andrew.
Lauren, thanks very much. So that's the two board members who are here. And we've also got one of our senior members of staff, and it's really helpful to have you here, Emma. Emma, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks. I'm Emma Cooper, Head of Land Rights and Responsibilities for the Commission. The picture is Butte behind me, where I first moved when I came to Scotland to manage a community-owned woodland. But more recently, I've been with the Commission for the last few years and working very much around ensuring that people can think about good practice in land ownership, management and use, helping people to put that into practice, thinking about how they can adopt different approaches to land ownership, management, use, engage communities, and so on, and help to embed the land rights and responsibility statement in practice and in policy. Thanks.
Emma, thanks very much indeed. So that's the three people who are here from the Commission. Also, although you can't see them, are some absolutely brilliant members of staff who keep the technology working. At least I hope they keep it working, but they always do keep it working. It astonishes me how well they do it. So I'm not going to introduce them. And they've hidden themselves behind their camera, but they're absolutely wonderful people, and I'm enormously grateful to them. This is being recorded, so if you're in your pajamas, you may wish to turn your camera off. That's up to you. But it's being recorded because we will put it up on our YouTube channel, because that means that people who couldn't make it this evening, but who still want to see or hear what on earth was going on, can do so. So I think it's helpful. So please, if you don't want to be seen, turn your camera off, and please don't say things that you'll regret later, because it is also being recorded for audio. We've done a public meeting every month pretty much since we started in 2017, or the end of 16. And I think it's been really important. We started in those beginning, of course, public meetings were not online, actually. They were always in a village hall or community centre or something all over the country, and we went all over the country doing that, and it was hugely important, and for a number of reasons. I think right from the beginning it informed what our priorities were, what our work was. Land reform is a huge subject, and we could do all sorts of things, but we haven't got the money or the people to do all sorts of things, so we've got to prioritize, we've got to focus. So these public meetings did and still do and will determine what we prioritize. So your contributions this evening are hugely important. And secondly, I believe profoundly that people who occupy positions like I do and like Lauren does as public appointees need to make themselves available, because the public have a right to hold us to account. So that is also what this is about. If you think that we're doing daft things, that you think this is a waste of time, or you think that we should be much more sympathetic to big landowners or much less sympathetic to big landowners, then challenge us. Please do. That's part of what this is about. We're here to be challenged. We're here to be held to account. And the third purpose is I hope that you'll find it interesting and informative and even exciting and motivating, because land reform is profoundly important to the future of our country, profoundly important to our children and our grandchildren. And I hope that you'll get a flavour of that this evening. The format that we found works is pretty straightforward. All these meetings are now online, and we haven't yet and may never go back to the village hall format. because a lot of people tell us they'd rather do it online. It's easier to attend. The format is I will do a very wee presentation that's just really that some of you will know lots about land reform, others will know nothing. So I'm going to have a wee 15-minute spiel that gives you a wee flavour of what on earth we're talking about. But then I'm going to open this up as a conversation, and I want to have a conversation, please. I want to hear from you what your thoughts are and your views are, and so on. And you can do that by either typing into the chat box. So if you click on that wee button that says chat, you can type into that, so you can put your thoughts into that. Or even better, you can go, I'm trying to find the right button. Someone will tell me, where is it? No, it's not that one. Sorry. Now I've got myself into a pickle. Yeah, there we are. Sorry about that. So you can either raise your hand, and I'm trying to find the hand raise thing, but it'll be there somewhere. I might actually have to, Emma, I'm sorry to get you to intervene, but I cannot find the hand raise button. Which is the button people click to raise their hand, please?
Well, I think Zoom has changed a bit recently, and where it used to be really obvious and a hand-shaped thing along the bottom of your screen, some people will have to press the 3 dots and the more button to find their raise hand function. But if anybody says in the chat that they want to speak, then we can just work it out in that way if people can't find it.
Emma, thank you. That explains why I couldn't find the hand button, because they've changed it and I have now found it. So if you go to the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's 3 dots. If you click that, there's a whole range of options, pause recording, all sorts of stuff. It says raise hand. You click that, you can raise your hand, and that way I'll know. So that's how this is going to work. We said we'd finish by 8:30, and we will finish by 8:30. I promise you that. So if your mother-in-law is coming around at 8:30, or your father-in-law, don't worry, I'll finish by then. So 15 minutes on what this is all about. First of all, this is where I'm going to, where's this? There we go. So as I say, if you want to tell us what you're hoping to get out of this, share your thoughts, whatever, use the chat function. Very helpful. What's this about? So most people know, I think, in Scotland that we have this extraordinary history that has left us with probably the most concentrated pattern of land ownership in Europe. And so, and because of that, we've got these extraordinary concentrations of landed power, where one person has immense power over a smallish area, a monopoly of power in some cases. You've got islands where one person controls all the land, the petrol station, the hotel, the holiday cottages, and everything else. So I think people know that land reform is something to do with addressing that sort of stuff, and trying to get Scotland to a place where, not just where we have a fairer approach to land ownership, but where the pattern of land ownership enables the country to flourish and be all that it can be, and that we're not held back by the fact that in some places you've got one person with a huge amount of power who doesn't want to do anything other than shoot things or whatever. So that's pretty well known. And I think most people also know that land reform is something to do with tenancies, tenant farming, and the rights of tenants versus the rights of landlords, or crofting and the rights of crofters. These are well-established land reform issues. But much more recent, and I think in some ways more challenging at the moment, are some other things. So I'm just going to run through these other things that we're grappling with. So there is a huge amount of money pouring into Scotland at the moment to invest in what is called natural capital. People believe that if they can block up drains on peat, if they plant trees, if they do all sorts of things, they can capture carbon, and they can then sell carbon credits in what is expected to be a very lucrative market. So land values in some places are rocketing, doubling, trebling, as this money pours in, mostly from outside Scotland. And that raises huge challenges. Natural capital is not just about carbon, but there's also an expectation that in the future, it will be possible to restore biodiversity and sell what are being called biodiversity credits. Now, that hasn't really happened yet, but it's expected. So money is chasing that too. And a lot of it, what is often called rewilding money. And that raises huge issues for people who live and work in these areas and who rely on the land for their living, and therefore the shops and schools and everything else. Another fairly new, perhaps not quite so new area that has been really important to us is the colossal amount of money, of land that is vacant and derelict in Scotland. Thousands of plots of land, especially actually around Glasgow, but in all over Scotland, there are these vacant and derelict sites, and not only is it's a terrible waste of land, but they're a blight on the people who have to live near them. And an awful lot of Scots live near a vacant and derelict site. So addressing that's very important. Community ownership was practically unheard of when I, much younger, was working in the Highlands and Islands Development Board in the late 80s, 90s. But it's now become commonplace, and we hear a lot about community ownership of land and even of buildings. But communities are buying bridges, public toilets, cinemas, all sorts of things. Communities are building affordable housing. Communities are creating new crofts. There's an extraordinary movement taking place there, and I'll say a bit more about that. We could, I think, and probably should, do more work on new forms of ownership and tenure. Shared ownership, where different rights in land are shared by different people. Common in some other countries. It's quite unusual for one person to own all the rights in a piece of land in some countries. Often these rights are owned by different people, grazing by one, shooting by another, building by another, mineral by another, and so on and so forth. That doesn't happen much in Scotland. The hutting movement is one that is often talked about. That's my granny's hut. I'm very proud of it. The hutting movement is one that's talked about, where actually the landowner owns the land under that hut, but my granny owned that hut. It didn't work then, but it could have worked. The reason it didn't work then was that the security arrangements were not strong enough, and the landowner ended up burning my granny's hut down. Land reform is also, I think, increasingly about tax and also about the financial support that goes to landowners. The huge amount of wealth, over 50% of Scotland's wealth is held in the form of land and property. It's massive. And many people are of the view that we don't tax it enough, and I'll say a bit more about that. And lastly, you can't escape the housing crisis anywhere in Scotland. Really, it's not just an urban issue, it's not just a rural issue, it's certainly an issue in Glasgow. And the way in which land is brought forward for building is key to that. It's very telling that if you look at take a graph of housing prices over the last 25 years, they've risen way ahead of inflation, as I'm sure you'll know. Certainly you'll know if you've got children in their 20s, as I have. But what's very telling is that the actual material cost has broadly just tracked inflation. So the difference is the cost of land. So the Land Commission was set up in 2017 by the Parliament, by the Scottish Parliament, and really quite a visionary thing to do. At that time, there was no other thought about land commissions in the UK, although it's interesting that other parts of the UK have since created land commissions, and there's still talk of more. But our job is to provide advice, mainly to government, but not entirely, to Parliament as well, of course, but also to other institutions and landowners and individuals. And we publish a lot of stuff. Everything that we've done is published. It's there for the public to see. There's nothing hidden. It's all on the website. And a lot of it includes recommendations. And of course, government will take the recommendations that they think they can deliver, and they won't take them all. We're national. We cover the whole of Scotland. We're tiny. We've just got a dozen or so staff, slightly more than a dozen staff. We're tiny. But we've got incredibly clever staff and incredibly motivated staff. So that allows us to, I think, punch above our weight. But what it does allow us to do is to produce these pieces of work with advice and recommendations which are really well thought through and thoroughly researched and so on. And we do our work in 3-year bites because that's what Parliament asked us to do. So when Parliament set us up, Parliament said in law, actually, you must every 3 years publish and table to Parliament a new strategic plan for the next 3 years. So that's what we've done. So we work in 3-year bites, and these public meetings help to inform what will go into those 3-year bites. I think it's worth just reflecting briefly on this point here. Our work is based on a very fundamental concept. It's a concept that was put in place by Parliament in 2016. It's pretty much unique to Scotland, and I think it's very powerful. I think the Parliament can be congratulated on this. And it says, without ambiguity, if you want to own land in Scotland, you will also take on responsibilities. With land rights go responsibilities. You cannot own land rights and forget the responsibilities. You must. The two are inseparable. And it's in there, it's law, it's in part 1 of the Land Reform Scotland 2016 Act, and it's profound. It affects everything, I think, that we're trying to achieve, as Emma referred to, in fact, in her introduction. So a little about the last 3 years, because I'll give you a flavour of what we do. But of course, we're now in 2024, so we're just starting another plan. A big focus the last 3 years has been this issue of concentrated land ownership, because it exercises a lot of Scots. People are not happy about the current pattern. They're not happy as much about the concentration of power as the concentration in terms of acres or hectares. It's about power, and whether that power is whether it's helpful to have concentrations of power, whether power should be inherited in that way, whether power is being accidentally and perhaps people are misusing it without being aware of it, or whether in some cases they are actually abusing it. So, real issue. We were asked to do a lot of work on this, and we did a lot of work on this, and we came up with a range of proposals that would significantly strengthen the emphasis on responsibilities for these larger landowners. In other words, to put controls on power. And we'll see, because Parliament is still, or sorry, the government is still working on bringing forward a bill. We're expecting it this year. So we don't exactly know what will be in it. We understand that a lot of the things we recommended will be in it. Importantly, I think one of the things that we understand that will be in it is that when large land holdings change hands in whatever way, there will be a public interest test. That's not an unusual idea. It's commonplace in many, many other countries in Europe, that when important bits of land change hands, there's a pause, our public authorities examine, is it in the interest to transfer this ownership? Is it in the interest to transfer it as one piece of land, or maybe to divide it? Or are there things that need to be done in terms of tenure to share some of that power? For example, maybe it could be transferred as one piece of land if a chunk of the farms were offered for tenancy, or crofts were offered, or whatever. So we'll see what happens, but we did a lot of work on that, and it's all on the website. Community empowerment has been a strong theme of this government, and that has manifested in community ownership. But it isn't just ownership, it's about empowering communities as a counterbalance in many ways to the power of ownership of land. The idea has actually been developing since the early 1990s. I sat in Lochinver Hall listening to the people who, in their own words, were plotting the acquisition of an estate, the Assynt Crofters. Some of you may remember them. It was a tremendous exercise, a tremendous achievement. It was actually entirely funded by crowdfunding, by private money, and it started something that has become extraordinary. There is now the Scottish Land Fund, as well as private money going in. Scottish Land Fund is lottery and publicly funded. 75% of people in the Western Isles now live on community-owned land. That's an astonishing statistic from nothing, or nearly nothing, not quite nothing, but nearly nothing in 1990. And it involves, as I said, land, woodland, buildings, bridges, public toilets, goodness knows what. There is, CRTB stands for Community Right to Buy, but I didn't want to clutter up the slide. There's a community right to buy in law now for extreme situations, but it's difficult to use because you are in effect confiscating someone's property. And so it's right in a property owner's democracy that there should be checks. And there's a leadership group that Lorne chairs, and he'll be happy, I'm sure, to talk further if you're interested, trying to find ways of maintaining the momentum around community ownership because it has been so successful. Emma referred to this and leads it, in fact. It is really important that people who have landed power exercise that power responsibly. I've said that already. Sometimes landowners say to us, well, that's fine, but what does responsible look like? I don't know what that means, what I'm meant to be doing here. So we've produced what the Chief Executive of Scottish Land and Estates called a script for landowners to follow. And I'm pretty pleased that a lot of them are following it. It's a set of protocols and tools and guidance and all sorts of things that spells out this is what responsible land ownership looks like. And an awful lot of them are following this. So it is really encouraging. It has no legal basis at the moment. We put it together. It is possible that in the Land Reform Bill, there will be proposals to give it some legal underpinning, because sadly, there are some landowners who still think they don't need to bother about them. The natural capital stuff I've mentioned before, forestry, carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and just these massive rises of land prices in some areas. A lot of it highly speculative. Some people are going to get their fingers burnt. The problem with all that is, I mean, investment bubbles happen every so often. We had the dot-com bubble and we had the South Sea bubble and all these different things. But it matters where communities are damaged when the bubble bursts, or indeed that if communities are damaged by the rapid changes in land use. And we know from the clearances what happens when land use suddenly changes. It's disastrous for communities because communities can't change that fast. And the same's happening now. You've got people buying big chunks of land, planting trees, claiming carbon credits, and laying off all the people who were previously working there as gamekeepers or whatever. That then damages the school, damages the shop and everything. So we've put together a lot of advice for government as to how you can regulate this, for investors as to how you can behave responsibly. And again, to be fair, most big investment companies don't want to be seen to be behaving irresponsibly. They want to behave responsibly. So they're working with us. But we're trying to deliver what the government calls a just transition to a low carbon economy. And it's a challenging business. But we're doing everything we can to advise on the land aspects. Vacant and derelict is a huge urban issue. It is a rural issue too, but it's massive in West Central Scotland. There are over 600 registered vacant and derelict sites in Glasgow, which means that practically everyone who lives in Glasgow lives very near a piece of vacant and derelict land. And that's shocking. It's a blight on these communities. It's a waste. It's wasted opportunity. There are some great community-led answers coming forward where communities have been empowered to do something about it. We've put together some advice on what we're calling compulsory sale orders, where the local authority would have the power to force the sale of these sites if people weren't using them. And you're lucky, actually, if you live in Glasgow, you've got a local authority there that is trying really hard to address what is not always an easy problem. Housing will continue to be difficult. What's really interesting is that other countries in Europe do it differently. And we did quite a lot of research on this, and we published reports. There's a cover of one of them here. And the guts of what we said was, look, if you have a system that depends on the landowner deciding where you're going to have houses and the landowner bringing land forward for planning permission, you've got a system that's not under democratic control. It's not under public control. It's at the whim of private owners, landowners, and developers. And in other parts of Europe, that's unusual. Government, and especially local government, has much more power to be assertive and say, right, we're going to have houses in that area. We're going to have houses there or there or there, and make it happen. And that idea of a more assertive role for government in housing development is one that we've discussed, published on, and recommended. It's a very interesting area, actually, not yet happening. Tax, happy to talk about this further. It's potentially hugely significant. We've done some work. We could do a lot more. We've done some work looking at future options. We've made it very clear that you could tax the value. There's an awful lot of value in land. You could tax it. It's not easy. There are unforeseen consequences that you have to think through, but you could do that. And you might raise a reasonable amount of money, but let's not get carried away here. But what you could also do is use tax to drive land reform objectives. So, for example, you could have quite high, significantly higher rates of tax applying to bigger land holdings or vacant and derelict land or other things. So you could use tax as a tool to drive policy rather than as a tool for raising money. Pretty much lastly, one of the board of the Land Commission is the Tenant Farming Commission, and he has special responsibility for tenant farms because there was so much difficulty and conflict and trouble between landlords and tenants. About 10 years ago, I chaired a review in 2014 on this subject. He puts in place codes of practice. They have a legal basis. He also can provide mediation support. And part of what he's doing is trying to drive down the average age of tenant farmers in Scotland in order to revitalise the sector more generally. It's a specialist function. We'll answer questions or discuss it if you want to. I'm not going to talk more about it now. So we're into the next strategic plan, and we put this before Parliament just 2 or 3 months ago. At this point in time, it's quite high level. We're starting, but we want to hear from you. We've said that there are essentially 3 things that we're going to focus on in the next 3 years, 3 high-level things. And I think these are important. The first is this. At the moment, decisions about land are made by very few people in Scotland on the whole. They're pretty much all made by, 400 people are in over half of Scotland. So these decisions, so I'm not sure if this is the right term, but I've used it before. We need to think about democratizing the decision-making about land in Scotland, empowering people, and especially local communities, to participate in and influence the decisions that are made about the land on which they live, for goodness sake. Secondly, and these are linked, secondly, power is too concentrated. I've said that already. And we need to look at ways of diversifying that. Now, one way is to reduce the average size of land holdings, but another way is to have different rights owned by different people, as I suggested earlier, and which happens in many parts of Scandinavia. And the third thing, which ought not to need saying, but we are saying, is, look, Scotland could be a significantly more prosperous country if we made more of our land. And many of these structural things, about having so few people with all the power and all this, actually result in suboptimal economic performance. So that's the 3 themes, and we'll be interested to hear more from you on those themes as we go forward. I just want to make this last point, which is that although it's the Scottish Land Commission and we're focused on Scotland, we are having a remarkable amount of influence elsewhere, particularly in England, where the Westminster government is very interested in what we're doing, but also in the big cities, in Manchester and Birmingham, where they're looking at our urban work. So this stuff's important, and we won't always get it right. And government, in any case, won't always implement our advice and recommendations. But where we get it right, where that's implemented, this is not just about Scotland. We have the potential to have a positive impact south of the border and beyond. And what I find fascinating is that many countries in continental Europe look to Scotland now in relation to access legislation and advice on that. And interestingly, recently, around crofting and regulated smallholding tenure as well, which is another thing we're very good at in Scotland, even though our crofting tenure needs significant improvements, but it's interesting. So that's enough from me. I'll say more just at the end of the meeting. So, but that's how to contact us. And obviously, after the meeting, we would very, very much welcome contact from you. But I think that's probably enough now. I want to throw it open, and I'm going to stop the sharing so that I can do that. Now, if you would like to put your hand up and make a contribution, what do you think about all of that? Do you think the things that we should be doing we're not doing? Do you think some of it's useful? Please tell us. And if you want to type into the chat, if you're shy and don't want to put your hand up, that's fine. But if you put your hand up, I'll ask you to speak. Over to you. Somebody's going to speak. Come on. Can't possibly be all that shy.
I'll speak.
Diane, brilliant. Go for it.
Yes.
Thank you.
So you've mentioned that over 600 derelict land sites in Glasgow, and it was work with the local council for that. What initiatives have they taken to basically get people to take over these lands and that land, and for what for?
So let me try and answer that, unless Emma might want to butt in. I'll kick it off. I used to chair Scottish Canals, so saw some of this at first hand. Please recognise that we're a tiny organisation. We are not on the ground in Glasgow digging up vacant sites. So the first thing that happened was that the Scottish Government produced £50 million, which is, in some ways, sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. In other ways, it's not a lot of money given the scale of this problem, but it was a fantastic step forward and a brave one from government. What I guess we're seeing two or three different things. We're seeing, through the planning system, much more pressure on private developers to use VDL for productive purposes. So you're seeing housing coming through in quite a number of situations in Glasgow. Glasgow in particular. I mean, I don't want to pretend that it's just Glasgow. This happens all over Scotland, but Glasgow City is a good council in this respect. So putting pressure on the private sector to use it, that's one. Using some of the available public money to deal with things. There are some genuine structural issues like contaminated land and so on, which have to be dealt with. So some of these sites are pretty hard. So using some of that money where appropriate, but also finding uses that can accommodate some of the problems. So, for example, it may be contaminated in the sense that digging it up for housing is not really sensible, but it may not be contaminated in the sense that you could make a good park or recreation or amenity area. Or it may be tiny and beside a busy road or whatever, and no use for housing. But you could have a community garden or allotments or something there. There's one just below the canal in North Glasgow. And the third thing that I think Glasgow's done well, but so have others, is to engage and empower community energy, community groups to do things for themselves. So a lot of this land is in public ownership, and I think we want to see more of where it's in public ownership, we want to see more of it made available to community groups. But I think that's, there are some good examples. I think that slide that I put up of the bike park, that's in Wishaw. So it's not quite Glasgow, but it's a good example of where land works like that. So that's a partial answer, and Lauren has helped with his hand up, so I'm going to let Lauren answer that. Go for it.
So I was just wanting to add, Diane, on a smaller scale, recently I came across a project in Glasgow, I think it was in the south side, called South Seeds, and it was an old changing rooms that near Queen's Park that had been lying derelict for a long period of time, and as I understand it, the City Council were able to give a long-term lease to the community group that's taken on responsibility for that development and really bring it back into community use. So it's become quite a hub for activity and, voluntary work in that specific area. So I know that's just a small example, but I would also point to the fact that there's, under the auspices of Community Land Scotland, there's a group has been set up called Community Ownership Hub in Glasgow and Clyde Valley. And they've been working with the helping communities that have maybe got aspirations to take on some buildings, develop them into anchor organisations. You're probably familiar yourself with ones like Kinning Park Complex, the Pyramid at Anderston, Barmulloch in Glasgow. In fact, funnily enough, that was one of our board meetings as the Land Commission. We went to Barmulloch, and we got a lot of insight to just how that kind of urban community development has been taken forward. So, sorry, Andrew, I just wanted to add to that response here. Back to you.
Yeah,
yeah, it's a good example, and there's clay pits up across the street that you probably know, Dan. That was a VDL site that Scottish Canals, Glasgow City, and Scottish Natural Heritage, as it then was, and the community put together. It's a fantastic place now, actually, and buzzing with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I work in the electric vehicle charging sector, and one of the issues with that just now, it's really moving at pace, but the difficulty is finding land to put these charging hubs on. So I was wondering if this, because, and that again feeds into the community, because you know, for kind of a just transition, a lot of those hubs are put in, you know, areas, affluent areas, or beside motorways, and not a lot of investment has been done in areas that are maybe a bit deprived and things like that. And you know, we're actually looking for land to help develop that right across Scotland, sort of thing. So that's interesting.
That totally makes sense to me, and actually would work. Definitely worth talking to the city council. The VDL register is on the public record. It's on the Scottish Government website. And actually, Nikki, if you can hear me, if you can find a link to the VDL register, that would be helpful. Put it in the chat. But anyway, search vacant land register Scotland, and you'll find it. And that lists 600 odd sites around Glasgow.
Excellent, thank you.
But I think what you're saying is absolutely right on electric charging. I came across yesterday a charging point in a very unexpected place where there weren't lots of people with fancy Teslas, and I was really encouraged actually to get it. Emma, do you want to add something?
I was just going to suggest, Diane, that you also have a conversation with the Community Land Scotland Urban Hub that Lorne mentioned, and the Community Development Trust Association Scotland, because where there is community-owned land already in Glasgow, they might really welcome collaborating with you. So that might be a good source of people to have a chat to about that.
Okay, great, thanks.
Emma, thanks. So just going to pick up a couple of things from the chat in the hope that someone, meantime, will decide they want to speak to us. Melissa, just because it links to that. So, Lorne, I don't know if you can see the chat, Lorne, but Melissa's just making a point that she's got a community group. They're working their way through Scottish Land Fund Stage 2, but thoughts on how do you empower. This whole business of empowerment is a difficult one. And it's often raised in these meetings. People say, oh, well, but people are too apathetic, or our community is not rich enough to be empowered. It's only communities with wealthy people that's got time for that. Although I have to say that's about the opposite of our experience. But Lorne, how do people like Melissa find some help from Community Land Scotland or whoever?
Yeah, Melissa, thanks for that point. That's a point that comes up quite a lot, and it's how to keep people engaged in the long process, maybe pre-acquisition of land. If you haven't been in touch with the Community Ownership Hub in Glasgow and Clyde Valley, I would certainly wish to put you in contact with them, because they can do a lot of hand-holding and also signposting to other kinds of support. And they will also be able to give the case studies of the various organisations, certainly well over 40 organisations, the last I heard, that they had helped in the Glasgow area, Glasgow and Clyde Valley. So I can maybe, through the chat, give you my email address, and I'll put you in contact with various people that maybe could help in supporting that. But it's a point well made, Melissa. Thanks for that.
Melissa, if you want to talk to us, please put your hand up. There are hundreds of these community initiatives now around the country. It's really inspiring, and your question at the end, how do you get people to engage in a pipe dream? Part of the answer to that undoubtedly is to let them see how many people in Scotland are busy delivering on pipe dreams. There are an awful lot of them, and it's very encouraging. So if you want to talk to us, stick your hand up. Meantime, I'm going to go back to Helena's question about tax. Lorne, so we did a bit of work on tax. I've said in the preamble that at some point we may well want to do some more, and government may want us to do some more. It's a fiendishly complicated and difficult area, not least because Scotland doesn't hold anything like all the levers. A lot of them are held in Westminster, and that makes it particularly difficult. So there's a difference between land value taxation in capital letters and taxing the value in land, not in capital letters. And maybe you could say a bit about that, Lorne.
Yep, thanks for that, and thanks, Helena. we did a specific piece of work on land value taxation, and for everyone's benefit, that is essentially taxation on the unimproved value of land. So it's actually quite difficult to take forward, and we looked at examples in other countries throughout the world there, and hopefully some of the backroom tech team will be able to maybe put up a link to our report on land value taxation. I think, to kind of paraphrase, much of our conclusion was perhaps land value taxation could be used on a targeted basis, perhaps for derelict and vacant land, to encourage landowners who have had the land in abeyance essentially for a long period of time, to obviously encourage them to have a productive use and make a contribution to the general economy. But on the wider area of tax, we set up an advisory, an expert advisory group a couple of years ago, and we looked at a whole range of taxation options. And again, there is a detailed report on our recommendations on that. Much of it was about what kind of incentives we could bring to bear for retail and other sectors post-COVID. So we had made some recommendations about non-domestic rates, but also we looked at the possibility of the Scottish Land and Building Transaction Tax having a supplement to that would be targeted on those large-scale landowners in their purchases, initial purchases. So there were a variety of recommendations there, but one of the things, and I think it was pointed out by Andrew in his original presentation, we always have to be very careful about unintentional consequences with tax. So we obviously have to look in great detail about all the various implications. And it also has to be added that some of the levers are reserved powers to Westminster in terms of some of the capital taxes, if we're looking at inheritance tax, and some of the major reliefs like business property relief or agricultural property relief. But that doesn't stop us making recommendations in that regard. So there's a whole wide spectrum of work that we have been involved with in tax. And as Andrew has previously flagged up, we'll probably be involved in more work on tax, because it certainly is an essential lever to support many of our land reform objectives. Thanks, Andrew.
Lauren, thanks. So I'm just trying to keep tabs on the chat. There's a lot of stuff going through there. Uwe, thanks very much for putting the register up. So that's the register of vacant and derelict land. That's got all the sites that are registered in Scotland. Will help you to see what's what. Dan and others who are interested in that. Melissa, I wish I was in the Tron bar too. That's terrific. But I can, well, it's just wonderful that people can log into these meetings from wherever they are. I'm really inspired by that, and I'm really grateful to you for joining and then participating so actively as you are. Thank you. To come back on tax, I mean, it'd be interesting, Helena, if you wanted to speak about it. It is, I mean, I do think it's an area that the Land Commission is going to come back to. I'll be quite surprised if we don't. I think it's probably an area that Scottish Government will come back to with Westminster around powers and devolved powers and all that kind of thing. Because there is an awful lot of value tied up in land. And because tax, as I said earlier, can also be used as a lever to make things happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. So it is important. You specifically asked, Helena, if it's in the land, if it's likely to be referred to in the Land Reform Bill. I think that's unlikely. The consultation on the Land Reform Bill was last year and lasted for several months. And I think it was just called Land Reform. I can't remember what it was called, but there was anyway a big consultation where the government set out the sorts of things it wanted to include in the bill and asked lots of questions. And it didn't talk about including taxation in the bill, because that would probably go in a finance bill rather than a land reform bill. So it wasn't mentioned. But I don't speak for the government. I don't know what the government will will want to do going forward. And clearly, if people say to us, here's a good idea, and we can do some work on it, then we will listen carefully. So lots of stuff in the chat in vacant and derelict land, and that's probably not surprising for Glasgow. So happy to talk further on that subject if you wish, or anything else at all, because we do quite a lot of different things. I'm looking for some yellow hands now. Assuming they're yellow, I'm colorblind. I just struggle with that sometimes, whatever color they're meant to be. Anyone want to offer some thoughts? Well, while you're thinking, I'm going to ask Lauren to talk a bit more about community ownership in an urban context, because I think, there's some fantastic initiatives happening in Glasgow linking to vacant and derelict land, but not just linking to vacant and derelict land. And one of the ones I love is just below the canal at Mary Hill, where there's a tiny wee bit of land been turned into a community garden. It's beautiful. But there's some huge things as well. Lauren, thoughts on that sort of subject that you might want to offer?
Thanks, Andrew. And you highlighted in your presentation that there's a community land leadership group that has been set up. And it brings together a lot of people who are involved in the community land movement, and many of them from urban areas. And what we're trying to do is to make the path easier for many community groups that wish to take forward purchase of property, purchase of buildings, purchase of land. So one of the topics that we're having at the next meeting of the Community Land Leadership Group is the asset transfer process. And this allows for communities to put up a good proposal to public sector organisations if a community group felt that it was better placed to take forward a development on that property, as it were. So that's one of the aspects of that. Another aspect that we were looking at was how to make the community right to buy legislation easier for communities to access. Some communities had fed back to us that they felt that some of it was overly bureaucratic and hard for many community groups, being voluntary organisations, to take forward. So as a result of that, there are various suggestions like a simple pre-registration process as part of community right to buy. Obviously, most of my experience is in the rural and island communities, but I was involved for 6 years on the South Uist buyout board and 6 years on the Gia, Island of Gia buyout board. And again, I have seen the truly transformational results as a consequence of communities taking ownership of land and undertaking various developments, whether that is about housing or it is recreational activities for communities, is businesses, is helping businesses set up. And again, in places like Gia, we've seen huge increases in the population from a very low base over the years. So there's a lot that can be done there. And again, in my experience of looking at many of the actual urban buyouts in the Glasgow and Clyde Valley area, there have been some amazing success stories. In some of the areas that have been termed in the past, some of the kind of more deprived areas particularly have come forward, and quite inspirational stories there. So I would urge people to maybe look at the Hub website to see many of the case studies as an inspiration. Pass back to you, Andrew.
Lauren, thanks. I'm going to move the conversation on a bit because Rosa, I'm sorry, I don't know where you're a councillor for, Rosa, but Rosa's raised the issue of land registered charges. And it is, so I mean, clearly, in the current climate with austerity and all the rest of it, public bodies are struggling. And so, where they can, they will make charges. And I'm sad to say that even the public bodies I've been involved in recently have had to think about this. They struggle not to avoid it if they can, but they will happen. So I'm not really going to go into that. But what I think is important about what you're raising, Rosa, is the issue that unless the public know who owns land, who has the power, if you like, then it is very difficult for ordinary people to influence what that person is going to do, say, think, act. And it's been a powerful theme of land reform actually in Scotland, and the Scottish government has recognised that if you want to empower people, you've also got to inform people. So the whole business of who owns stuff, there's a lot of effort been made by the Scottish government to make ownership more transparent. Emma, without going into lots of technical detail, but it might be useful to just reflect on that. I mean, if you're just an ordinary person in Glasgow or anywhere else for that matter, how do you go about sort of finding out who the landowner is and knocking on their door and getting them to listen to you? You've done codes of practice and stuff on this. Why don't you say a wee bit about that?
Yeah, we have. So we do encourage landowners to be transparent about the ownership. So that means they put the land that they own on a website, on a map. It's really easy to access. And we always recommend that landowners have a particular point of contact that people can get in touch with. So an actual person with an email address and a phone number, ideally, that if something's happening, you can immediately get in touch. And that's helpful for landowners because it means that if there's cows escaped or if there is a fire in a building, then the owner can be got in touch with really quickly by people who've spotted the problem, basically. But if land, is looking like there isn't a current owner there, if it's looking like it's vacant, then it can be tricky to find out who owns it. The Registers of Scotland can often help, but sometimes that's for a really small charge. It's a few pounds, less than £10 for the title of land. There's also another website called Who Owns Scotland that Andy Whiteman has put together. Now, there's a registration fee for that, and I'm sorry, I don't know what it is for individuals, but he's also started to put together a more comprehensive map of land ownership in Scotland as well. So there's those two good sources. You might also find that your local council knows who owns land. So getting in touch with them, specifically finding out about the where the council's vacant and derelict land register is and who that department is. And I'll have a look on the web in a minute for the Glasgow one and see what I can find. That might also have some more details of ownership on as well. Also, in some communities in particular, asking around can be really helpful. So just around the corner from me, there's an empty garage. And there was a good chat on Facebook on the community forum about who owned the garage. And I believe that the answer was eventually retrieved with a phone number and so on, and the problem solved. So actually using your social media and your contacts can also be really helpful. But it does feel like you're a little bit of a detective at times. And there are real efforts underway to improve that situation at the moment. But going back to tax, it's one of the real challenges if we were actually to introduce some kind of land valuation tax. And a real challenge for communities as well. I did pop in the chat a little bit higher up a route map for communities. And actually, I find that it's useful in all sorts of circumstances because it kind of takes you through the process of thinking, do we want to do something with this land or do we want somebody else to do something with this land? And if you want somebody else to do it, okay, do you know the owner? Great, that's fairly straightforward. Do you not know the owner? What are the different ways in which you might be able to find out the ownership? So there's some really helpful guidance on there and it's a really accessible approach to it. I think that's everything I can think of just for now, but I'll put anything else in the chat that I think of in the next few minutes.
Emma, thanks. I may come back to you. Rosa, I do want to thank you for raising this issue. You've prompted Tricia to put something in the chat too. Because it is so, it's actually been, I've been involved in land reform for quite a long time, and it's been one of the fundamentals from quite early on that we just don't know who owns chunks of our own country. And that's outrageous. These people are wielding significant power in Scotland, and we don't know who they are. And they may not even be here. They may be an offshore company in St. Helena or somewhere, or some other goodness knows place. So getting that sorted, and we are getting it sorted as a country. This is not the Land Commission, but Scotland is getting it sorted. But it's taking longer than a lot of people would like, and there's a lot of resistance to it. Of course, a lot of people don't want you to know that they own a scalp of Scotland. So it's very important. Thanks, Rosa. Tricia has raised a very specific example in a way. I don't know if you want to speak, Tricia. If you do, please stick your hand up. But I'm going to come back to her because she looked at the VDL link, found a site near her, in her community council area. What does she do now to find out more about it? Can you, do you want to say something about that, Emma? Or do you want to say something, Tricia, about it first? I'm not seeing Tricia's hand, so I'll go to Emma. Emma.
Yeah, I'm just having a look into it actually at the moment on the web. So I'll see
So I
what I
don't
can
quite
find out.
Yeah, well, okay.
But do come
Yeah,
to us
Tricia,
at the Good Practice team. I'll pop our email in the chat with any of these kind of questions and problems, and if we can help, we will, or if we can signpost you, we'll do that as well. So I always like to hear from people a little bit after these public meetings on their specific challenges, and we'll see if we can help basically. But yeah, Tricia, I think having a chat with the city council might well be helpful in identifying that person if their details aren't on the map. Yeah, thanks, Ube. Yeah.
thanks, Emma. So Tricia, we'll do what we can to help you. Please email. Emma's going to put an email address somewhere up for you. Please email us. If not, just use the one, the info at Land Commission stuff. It's on the website. Email us. Give us the specifics. We'll do what we can. Oh, Tricia's got a hand up. Tricia, thanks. Please come in. That would be wonderful to hear a real voice.
Hello, it's a real voice. I'm Tricia. I've seen the list. It lists some land near me, which is quite near Glasgow Green, but I haven't. I know where the land is, so a map wouldn't help. So, apart from speaking to Councillor Sally, whom I've met, how do I go about this?
So I think what we need you to do, please, is email Emma she's put an email address in there.
Right.
Email Emma with what the site is, the name of it off the register, if you wouldn't mind. And Emma will get back to you. And she'll probably signpost you to people who can help with that. Is that the best way of dealing with this, Emma?
Yeah.
Off the top of our head, we won't know the detail of this site.
Yeah, that's probably the best way. But definitely worth chatting to your local councillor, Tricia, as well. It's the kind of thing that they should be able to help with also.
If it's near Glasgow Green, it may well be in public ownership. I wouldn't be surprised. But I'm not. I mean, I know that area pretty well too. We'll do what we can for you, Tricia. If you wouldn't mind emailing Emma. Rose is coming back with something too.
Sorry, so if we see any site on there, do we email Emma, or is there a quick way to find out directly?
Well, there's not. Well, I mean, the city council puts so sites on the register have been put on the register by the relevant local authority. So if it's in Glasgow City, it's the Glasgow City Council that put it on. So they will have information as well as to so your local council.
Sorry, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Emma, are you trying to? Yes, go for it, Emma.
Have you tried the Registers of Scotland? Sorry, was that you saying about that before?
No, I haven't tried anything. It's just now I've had a look at the list and I thought, I know that place. Wonder who owns it. Yeah.
Registers of Scotland then would be your first port of call. I'll pop the link to them in the chat. And as I say, I think it's usually about £3 to get the ownership of a site. If they don't have it, then it's a more complicated thing to sort out for you. And I was thinking that you'd done that because I've got my chat bits mixed up.
No.
Yeah. What I do have is from that vacant derelict land community route map is a more comprehensive explanation of the different ways to find out ownership if it's problematic for you. And I'm just going to post that exact page in the chat right now, and then I'll post the Registers of Scotland thing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we'll do what we can to help. I want to move the conversation on slightly, but picking up, Rosa incidentally has put up a really helpful link to local councillors in the area. So thanks, Rosa, for doing that. I want to move on to a wider point here, which is, so let's suppose you know, not always, but usually you can find out who owns land. If you find out, and either it's lying vacant and derelict and a pain to everybody, or they're in some way not doing, either misusing their power or doing things that you don't like, or whatever, what do you do about it? And I think it'd be useful to explore that a bit. So in a big rural context, many of the proposals for the land reform bill that's expected this year will start to bring in much tighter regulation on big landowners. But small owners of pieces of land in urban Scotland, some of whom are public owners, it is less easy to get leverage on that. And I think that's partly what Rosa was kind of getting at. And obviously, no question, we recognize, we acknowledge that. So let's just have a thought, Lauren. I'll maybe come to you if that's okay. So in the context of quite small bits of land, I mean, we put forward advice on this idea of a compulsory sale order, and that's a kind of nuclear option, that if you're on a small piece of land in Glasgow and you're not using it, we think you should be made to sell it at auction to someone who will use it.
Yeah, Andrew, I think that was what I was wanting to come in with, was talking a bit more about compulsory sale orders. And it would be useful also, perhaps, if the backroom team would put a link to the work that we did on compulsory sale orders. We put forward a proposal or recommendations to government. And this is, many of you will be familiar of the compulsory purchase order powers, where local authorities or other public organisations can acquire land. But we had looked at it from another perspective of some land, perhaps vacant and derelict land that has lain idle for a long period of time. How can you actually force a sale? And we put forward recommendations. One of my colleagues, Professor David Adams, that was previously a professor at University of Glasgow in urban planning, was a key figure in developing these proposals. At the moment, we don't know how that may or may not be taken forward. There has been some talk that there's to be a community wealth building bill, and it may form part of that as a proposal to come forward. But it would certainly, I would suggest, as a commissioner, it would break an impasse to some of the sites that really blight some of the urban areas and have been derelict for a long period of time, and force a sale by public auction. So it would be another tool in the toolbox for communities working with public bodies to actually try and accelerate change in an area. So, sorry, Andrew, that was just the point I was wanting to come in on. Thank you.
No, thanks. I'm very grateful. You've articulated that very clearly. And if they haven't already done it, I've no doubt our comms people will put up a link to that piece of work. But it would be important for communities, and therefore for councillors like Rosa and others, that if there's a piece of vacant derelict land in your constituency, and you as a local authority had a compulsory sale order of power, you could force the sale of that at public auction, and the community clearly could then the community actually could probably use its preemptive right to buy in that kind of situation. So there's lots to play for in there. I think we should move this conversation on to one or two other things that might be of interest. But there's the comms team put the compulsory sale order stuff up. Thank you, Nikki and others. So other points, as one would expect, a lot of this is about vacant derelict, urban issues and so on. Lauren, I wonder if you wanted to say a wee bit more about the land reform bill, because although it's not really particular to urban Scotland at all, in fact, it's more particular to rural in many ways, it is an enormously important piece of legislation. And although we don't quite know what's going to be in it, but we've a rough idea. Do you want to just sketch out some thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. This bill will be taken forward this year. Much of the focus is on concentrated land ownership of scale, and we made various recommendations on that. It is likely there will be a proposal for a public interest test for land ownership of scale. So there will be various criteria that will need to be met for landowners. At the moment, what we're hearing is that there may be a threshold of 3,000 hectares, but I think as that bill winds its way through Parliament, I think there will be other proposals to maybe lessen the threshold there. Also talking about a management plan for land ownership of scale. And also, I think particularly of interest to ourselves are that various protocols have been developed by Emma and her team in the Good Practice team. And these are best practice on community engagement in a wide variety of activities with relation to land ownership. At the moment, these best practice protocols do not have a legal underpinning, but they're perhaps within this land reform bill, and we'll see the draft, I'm sure, in the next few months, will perhaps have a proposal that there will be a legal underpinning which kind of mirrors the work that is presently done by our tenant farming commissioner, Bob McIntosh, because the actual codes that he has introduced in the tenant farming side of our activities do have a legal underpinning and do have a force of law behind them. So the proposal within the land reform bill is really to mirror that, and it would give, again, extra strength to communities in some of their interactions with landowners if there is that legal underpinning to best practice protocol. Pass back to you, Andrew, if you want to add to that.
Not really, and I'm anxious that we respond to what people want to talk about, but the bill is important. I mean, it's a bold step by this government, which you know, who knows what will be in it. It will be argued about in Parliament. Different political parties will have different views, but it's important, I think, to Scotland as a whole, urban and rural, to be aware that there are pretty serious proposals now on the table to essentially to regulate the exercise of landed power. I think that's probably the best way I could put it. There's detail in it, as Lauren said, but fundamentally we've got a government that is determined to ensure that there is a counterbalance to the power that goes with large-scale land ownership, and that counterbalance enables ordinary people to have a say in what's going on and on that land. I personally think that is a big step forward for this country. It'll move us much closer to many other parts of Europe who find our approach to land in Scotland quite remarkable. I remember talking some time ago to a foreign landowner in Scotland. I won't say who he was or where he was from, but it was a he, as they often are. But I said, why on earth do you come to Scotland to buy a big scalp of land? Well, what's the point? You know, why don't you just buy some land in your own country? And he said, oh, I couldn't. There's no point. I mean, I can do things in Scotland I couldn't possibly do at home. And that was very telling. And I think we're changing that now. So that's encouraging. Any other particular issues that anyone wants to talk about? Please type in the chat, raise your hand. If not, if there's one other issue I would quite like to just flag because I think it's important for Scotland. No hands going up. I just want to talk a little bit about the housing work. That has been important. I wonder, Nikki, if you could put a link to the housing work if you haven't already done so. Emma, you're not that close to the housing work, but I don't know if you want to. Do you want to say something about it? If not, I'll say a bit more about it.
I'm not so close to it. You get started and I'll add anything on, I think.
A bit unfair, this, isn't it? We haven't got a housing expert with us. But... So yeah, I'm in danger of slightly repeating myself from the presentation, but I'll say a bit because I think this is very important. Certainly to people like me with kids in their 20s, this is hugely important. The price of housing in Scotland has rocketed in my lifetime, way ahead of inflation. So I was in a position with my wife to buy a house 30 years ago. My children are not in a position to do that. And I'm normal. That's replicated right across Scotland. And what has happened is that the cost of building materials has broadly kept pace with inflation, but the cost of buying a site for the house has rocketed way ahead of inflation, and that's where the problem is. Now, there's lots of reasons. It's not, you can't, we have to be careful not to oversimplify this. It's not just that landowners are not letting you build houses. Why would they? If they can sell land for a whopping amount for a site, they will. So it's more complicated than that. It's to do with planning, it's to do with infrastructure, it's to do with all sorts of things. But fundamentally, it is a land reform challenge. We must address it. The population of the country, by and large, is rising. In some places, it's actually falling. Harold carried a bit on that today. So we need more houses. Average household size is falling, and therefore, even just for a static population, you need more houses. So we've got to address this. And we've produced a lot of work on it. There's the link now in the chat. Nikki, thank you, or whoever's, Scarlett, or whoever's putting these things up, thank you. We've produced a lot of work already. I think my belief is that this is going to be a big challenge of the next 5 or 10 years for land reform and others. And if anyone wants to comment on it in the chat or otherwise, I'd be very grateful. Melissa, thank you for your comment. Unless we can find a way of enabling government, and whether that's central or local government or even something more local, doesn't matter, but enabling a more assertive approach from government that says, look, we need houses will be built here. This is not, we're not going to sit in our hands and wait for some landowner to come and say, I'd like you to build houses here. We're going to make it. We're going to be more assertive. And we're going to see a more diverse range of initiatives. So instead of this whole thing being dominated by a handful of big providers, where you've got a concentrated power of another kind, you're going to have things, well, such as is happening in the village near where I live, where the community got fed up waiting, bought a scalp of land off the farmer, and they're building houses, community-owned houses, which they will then rent to my kids' friends. It's great. But I think this is going to be a big issue going forward. Lord, do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Absolutely agree with what you're saying. I think another interesting aspect in much of the work that we've done as a land commission, we are anticipating a change in town centres, city centres, and just with the way that retail is moving more onto online, there'll be less maybe stores, but an encouragement for more housing within city centres. It was particularly interesting to read the proposals from the Glasgow City Centre Living Strategy, where there's a proposal for the current population of 20,000 in the city centre to be increased to 40,000 by 2035. And that mirrors another example that I'm kind of familiar with in Dumfries town centre, where the community is actually buying up some of the derelict buildings in the town centre, unused buildings, and converting maybe the bottom, the ground floor into community spaces or for voluntary groups, but housing developed upstairs. So it's really trying to bring back some of the residential accommodation into the town centre in Dumfries, and that actual initiative is being led by the community. But it's very encouraging to also see the proposals in Glasgow City Centre. And again, when I was at university, I stayed in Baird Halls in Sauchiehall Street, which is, used to be the Beresford Hotel. And that was in the 1980s. But, a recent visit to Sauchiehall Street, it didn't look its best, but I know that there are proposals to rejuvenate that part of the city centre and again bring in more housing, more residential. So hopefully there will be a vibrancy that will come on the back of that. That was all I just wanted to add, Andrew, there.
Well, thanks. It's a hugely important issue. Okay, I think probably the chat's largely dried up. Melissa, thanks for your point again on the housing. Yeah, Michael, thank you. This whole point about ultimately an awful lot of land reform comes down to empowering ordinary people so that Scotland's land is used, and I use that word in a very flexible way, is used to optimum benefit for the whole of to all of Scotland. The first strategic plan we actually published was simply called "Making More of Scotland's Land," and we were clear that that was what we were about. We were about making more of it for more of us, for all of us. And so there's a huge link between housing and empowering people, and challenging the monopoly of power over land, challenging the monopoly of power over house building, challenging the monopoly of power over house ownership, and so on. So lots and lots of big, I think, land reform and wider issues in there for the future. Unless anyone has any other pressing issues, I'm going to suggest we call it a day at that. We've had a really interesting conversation. Scarlett, thanks. There's more about the town centre stuff and so on. Great. Okay, I think I'm going to wind it up at that. That's been really, really useful. I put up, sorry, I'm just trying to follow what's going on in the chat as we talk at the same time. I put up at the end of the wee presentation, but I'll just repeat it again. There's an email address. It's just I think it's just info@landcommission.gov.scot. I put that up deliberately because in a village hall, for years and years, we used to do public meetings in village halls, and at the end of the public meeting, you'd have a really good, exciting, challenging discussion. People would challenge you and all the rest of it, and then you'd wrap the meeting up, and then 3 or 4 people would come sidling up, and the whole thing would start off again. But it would be in private because they didn't want to talk in a public forum. They wanted to talk to you privately. And that's very difficult online. So I always say at the end of these things, please, if you would like to say something privately, tell us something privately, just have a private conversation, you're just shy, whatever it is, please use that email address, info@landcommission.gov.scot. Please use it. Please email it. Say who you are, say what you're, give me a phone number if you don't mind, or if you don't want to give me a phone number, just say who you are, and I will give you my phone number, and you can phone me that way. But I valued those private conversations after the meeting, and I don't get them now. So if you would like a private conversation, do not hesitate to contact us through that sort of thing. I will phone you. I will guarantee you a private conversation and anonymity, and that way you can tell me anything you like. So I hope you find that helpful. Otherwise, thank you very much again. So I'm just going to check there's nothing else. Thank you very much indeed for your participation. I hope you found that useful. Don't have a date for the next one of these, but we do them in different parts of Scotland each month, more or less. So just watch the website. We'll be back in Glasgow in usually about years, roughly a yearly cycle, 1 to 2 years. We're around and about. And the subjects are obviously different depending on where we are in Scotland. But thank you very much indeed. Have a safe journey to your kitchen or your drinks cabinet or wherever you're off to now. And we'll look forward to another few years of land reform going forward. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.